As with all of our presentations at Royal Roads University, we begin, we begin with a land acknowledgement. So Royal Roads University is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen and Kosepsum ancestors and families. This statement means that we at Royal Roads recognize the importance of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples' relationships, and we continue to learn to understand the history, present, and future scopes of Indigenous peoples. One more big thank you before we get started with our presentation today, and that is to our Human Security and Peace Building Program area for sponsoring today's dialogue. So looking at this slide here, you see a quick snapshot of our School of Humanitarian Studies. And within that lives our Master of Arts and our graduate diploma in Human Security and Peace Building. If you have any questions about the programs here at Royal Roads University or our Human Security and Peace Building programs, please feel free to connect with us at learn.more@royalroads.ca. And with that, we will get started. So I will pass the microphone over to Dr. Kenneth Christie, who's the program head of our Master of Arts and Graduate Diploma in Human Security and Peace Building. Hi, Ken. Thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for organizing this, Selena and Athena. It's great to be here. So, what we thought we would do in this webinar is talk a little bit about the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the human security implications of that withdrawal, because they have been massive. If you've been following the news recently in the past few months, and we've seen that the recent withdrawal of American and other troops from Afghanistan after about 20 years has once again allowed the Taliban to re-emerge and come back as the major power brokers in a chaotic and anarchistic situation. So this withdrawal has been a complete humanitarian disaster for ordinary Afghans and looks likely to destabilize the country once more and provide a descent into fear in terms of human insecurity and conflict. Now, that's the worst case scenario. We are hoping, of course, that things will not become like this, but a lot of indications, of course, suggest this. The intervention in Afghanistan after 20 years has failed, and vulnerable Afghans will bear the brunt of this failure to a large extent. So, from a human security perspective, which is what we're focusing on, the withdrawal is highly problematic. Canada, which has in the past been a strong proponent of human security, should hope that freedom from fear and freedom from want, the two pillars of the human security perspective, have been strengthened in Afghanistan. However, there's not that much evidence to support this on the ground. Yes, there has been some gains. Women were represented in parliament, girls were attending school, and yet these gains are overshadowed by many elements of what many still regard as a failed state. It looks highly likely that every piece of social progress may be dismantled by the Taliban, and patriarchal extreme laws will be reintroduced and gains made for vulnerable groups reversed. So what we want to do in the webinar is explore some of these human security challenges for the Afghan people, especially women and girls, in the wake of this withdrawal. Of particular interest, of course, is in this situation, is the human rights, is the human security perspective from women and girls who face serious difficulties in the light of Taliban actions and practices. Now we have three, I hope we have three, but we're not 100% certain of this at the moment. We have three speakers who will be engaged in a kind of conversation like style about what's actually going on in Afghanistan and how we can explore these human security implications. Our first speaker, who we're hoping will still be able to make it, is Pashtana Durrani. And Pashtana started her journey as an activist and human rights defender, and she's now a community development expert focusing on digital literacy. She's also the founder and director of the grassroots level non-profit Learn Afghanistan. And through this part of this project, through a project called Soraya through Learn, she has educated 7,000 girls and boys in Kandahar. Through another project, Project Aisha, she has trained more than 80 teachers in digital literacy, and through Learn's Project Malaria, Durrani has reached out to 150 girls and trained them in menstrual hygiene management. She also received the Malala Fund Education Champion Award and a Development Fellowship on Sexual and Reproductive Healthcare from the Aspens Institute. So welcome, Pashtana. I'm not 100% if she's going to be able to make it today, but we certainly hope so. Our second panelist that is going to engage in the conversation is Dr. Athena Madden. She's a core faculty with the School of Humanitarian Studies, one of my best colleagues in the program, and she has worked in Afghanistan as a health worker, supporting midwifery training, maternal and child health intervention, addictions intervention, and the rehabilitation of child soldiers with local NGOs there since 2012. And our third panelist is Dr. Lauren Oates, and Dr. Oates was a graduate of the Human Security and Peacebuilding Program at Royal Roads, and she has research interests including education in conflict and post-conflict countries, technology for education, and open educational resource materials. Lauren has led projects in Afghanistan, such as a program that trained 10,000 teachers and a network of village libraries and basic literacy classes for girls and women who missed out on their education under the Taliban. She has worked to make these educational materials accessible to teachers in their own languages through several translation projects and participated in the creation of the first digital library for teachers in Afghanistan. So if any people are experts on this subject, certainly these three people that I've been discussing in the run-up to the webinar. Now, what I'd like to do actually is just hand over the floor a little bit, and we'll start off with, and as I say, I'm not sure Pashtana is here right now. Start off with Lauren and see if she could just say a few words about the current situation in Afghanistan, and then move on to Athena. And if Pashtana is joining us, move on to Pashtana at the end. Say a few words about the human security situation in Afghanistan, and then we'll have some more specific questions, and then we'll get into question and answers. So if we could start with Lauren. Lauren, what's your impression of what's happening? I mean, your most up-to-date impression and some of the human security. My impression is that people are really concentrating at the moment on the whole freedom from fear, which is taking sort of individuals who are in a terribly vulnerable situation, terribly vulnerable political situation, and concentrating on that. But of course, there's the other factor, freedom from want, because we know that there's a real food security situation going on in Afghanistan where there's a lack of resources and a lack of food. But maybe you could find some time to comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. Nice to see lots of names I recognize from the program after a little while. That has been in the news lately, the situation with regards to food insecurity. There's a very real hunger crisis facing the country right now. There's the banking sector on the verge of collapse. People can't actually access cash, even if they do have cash, to be able to buy basic needs. And that's affecting everybody, not just the rural poor, but people who very recently had even high-level jobs in government ministries and NGOs and so on. It's been a challenge for my own organization. We run programs in Afghanistan, and of course, those programs have costs. So getting money into the country to cover costs has been very tricky. But what I think it's really important to recognize that those humanitarian issues are really interlinked with human rights issues and human security issues. I saw a quote in somewhere on CBC today where a policy commentator was saying that, well, we have to forget about things like women's rights right now because there's this hunger crisis, and we have to talk about people's basic needs, and we can come back to women's rights later. But those things are really integrally connected. A lot of the poverty that people have suddenly found themselves in is because women aren't allowed to work anymore or go to their jobs. It's because women are afraid of the life that they're going to have in the country. And so people are wanting to leave. This whole destabilization is coming about from that. So I don't think that we should separate those two things. I think they go hand in hand. And it's just as important to advocate that the Taliban eliminate their discriminatory policies as it is to advocate for things like humanitarian aid to channel to people who need it. Just recently, some of the G20 countries have decided to take an approach of trying to get cash aid directly into people's hands, so bypassing the new Afghan government, because that's a concern for donor countries, is channeling money through the Taliban. So looking for creative ways to get around that. And that's another thing that my organization is also facing. How do we spend money and run programs in the country while circumventing a government that we don't want to collaborate with in any way, shape, or form? And I guess the other kind of characteristic that we're seeing in the past couple of weeks is I think that the Taliban letting go of some of their pretense around putting on this more enlightened face for the world. I think they were at pains to claim that they're different now, that everybody is safe. There's an amnesty that was declared. They won't be seeking vengeance on people from the former government. Their rule wouldn't be as harsh. Girls could go to school. And bit by bit, we're seeing that they're the same old Taliban as ever. Girls' schools are closed for grades 6 to 12. So more than half the school age population is out of school for girls right now. And we've already seen things like criminals' bodies being hung in the street after being executed, extrajudicial executions. So really all the same characteristics of their rule from the 1990s. And I think that they're relying on the international community to ignore that, and the media to go away, and the world to move on. And I really hope that that isn't how it goes down. And I do think, although it's such a depressing situation and it feels like everything is lost in some ways, I think it's important to recognize that this time, that when they've taken over, it's a totally different society than it was in the 1990s. Which is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that this is not a population that is ready to accept Taliban rule very willingly. There's been a lot of very vocal and courageous opposition to the Taliban, women who have protested on the streets, despite the very real risk in doing so. People who are just not ready to say, I'll give up everything, my career, my education, my dreams for my kids. So I don't think they're going to succeed in imposing their regime on people the same way that they did in the 1990s. But it's also hard because it's so hard for that generation that's grown up without the Taliban in charge to live under this regime. And for that reason, millions of people want to leave the country. And are attempting to leave the country, and who can blame them? So yeah, that's a few early thoughts on the situation on the ground.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And Athena, do you have some thoughts you might share with us?
Sure. Thank you. I apologize for the background noise. It's I have an unhappy toddler at the moment. And thank you for being here today, everybody, for your interest in this humanitarian crisis. I will note that Pashtana has also joined us, so I'm grateful and glad that we'll be able to hear from her as well. I think, let me just make sure. Would it be easier? Okay, so I think the toddler is settling down. Thank you. I can contextualize some of these comments. I'll link to some of the things that Lauren has said. So I have worked in Afghanistan and with Afghan colleagues since 2011 in preparation for my first trip there in 2012. And there have been so many changes since that time, but the relationships and the tensions to some degrees have remained the same. Something that Lauren said back in the 1970s and 80s, or I'll go back in history, in 1965, in Afghan history, the first female was elected to Afghan parliament. There were no external actors. Women at that time were able to go to school and hold professional jobs without any threats to their safety or their families. We see very much a reversal now. We see very much that, as I understand it, as I'm informed by my colleagues, that there, even today, I heard from some colleagues who are working with refugees resettling in Canada, that there were a mom with her two children wanting to flee at the airport, and they were beaten because they were recognized at the airport, having held public office. So there are a number of security concerns for women who are there, who are not able to utilize their degrees, their education, their skill sets, their contributions in a professional capacity to the country. And I think that is difficult to witness as someone who, I'm sure like Lauren, I'm sure also Pashtana will have things to add to this, but as an external citizen wanting to support and help Afghans, seeing the gains that have been part of the initiatives and endeavors that we are striving to do, it's difficult to see those gains set back. So I agree that Lauren is suggesting that the Taliban had wanted to rebrand themselves as a moderate force, but as we look at how they've struck up, as we look at how they've set up their parliament, there are no female colleagues. There are none of the original female politicians or people in parliament are associated with the new regime. The Taliban is a diffuse term, but as we are seeing, there are different interpretations to the degree in which Sharia law will be set up. So we do have very restrictive rules of law that are ongoing in certainly very rural areas of the country. And so the gains that I remember helping, I wouldn't say be part of or help contribute to, they were not my gains, but I'm just reporting them as gains that I witnessed in maternal and child health, in addictions rehabilitation. So many of those are scaling back now and unable to move forward. Hospitals and hospital actors or healthcare actors are also very much targets at the moment because they have had access to international funding, international equipment, and in some instances techniques that may be at odds with Islamic models and conceptualizations of healthcare. So that is also a problem that I'm trying to help from abroad to help provide some sort of adaptation of current biomedical models of treatment and understand the Islamic models of treatment. So there are so many different ways in which as I'm understanding that my colleagues have mentioned, their lives and their professions and their ability to act for the Afghan people are changing, but there's no centralized plan in which they're able to receive support, humanitarian aid. Waste mentioned, or Dr. Arya mentioned in the chat, and he will be a future panelist with us, that banking and money transfer, cash transfers is a big concern. The UK and the United States have withdrawn, or they've frozen all of their dollars of international or humanitarian aid. So the delivery of humanitarian equipment and supplies are not making it to people, and it's not making it to the country. So people are unable to withdraw cash for their goods, and it is a cash economy in many instances. We also see that specifically to women, the cost of burqas, merchants are increasing the cost of burqas, so a lot of women are unable to purchase the burqas, or if they are purchasing the burqas, then they have to withdraw. They have to allocate resources, or they can't buy groceries, or they're not able to pay other bills for survival. So those are the things that I'm hearing. I certainly feel for the Afghans who are resettling back in Canada. I'm connected to a network here for refugees being settled in Eastern Canada and BC. We are hearing stories of fear, of sadness, of a loss of hope for their futures in Afghanistan, but hope to resettle and build back Afghanistan better from afar. So I think it's very complex. We also hear a lot of voices of crying abandonment from the international community, or anger at the international community, and specifically the US, who withdrew at a rate that prioritized their own timelines and prioritized their own developmental indicators and rates of development or progress indicators more than they prioritized listening to what Afghan actors at the time expressed were the priorities. So then there's also fear that the Taliban won't act in good faith or negotiate in good faith with external humanitarian actors now. So what does that mean for the future of humanitarian aid? And last thing that I wanted to discuss was I'm connected also to a number of artists. I think, Lauren, you mentioned this, but the Taliban back in the 1990s forbade any music or curtailed artistic activity. And for a number of years, our community of artists were very much a visible source of resistance in the community. And history, oral history, traditions were kept alive through the form of music and playing the harmonium and singing in private circles. But certainly those private circles are much more hesitant to gather now because for fear of retribution from the Taliban. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty from my friends and colleagues. I think there's a lot of sadness and grief that we will need to deal with as we move forward. But most practically, as has been indicated, there's the issue of how can we support and help humanitarian aid be delivered to where it is needed most. And where it is needed most, it's for women and children. We know that from previous humanitarian crises that where women and girls are able to be part of the rebuilding back of communities, that children are able to succeed and go to school to greater degrees than if they are excluded from those rebuilding efforts. And today is day 25 of that ban on girls returning to school. And we know from child development literature that at the age of 9, if a female child is unable to go to school for a period of now day 25, incrementally their ability or their chances to be able to complete school and be literate in order to support their community decreases incrementally for every 25-day period. It decreases 50%. So we're at a crisis point for the ability of girls to be actors, to help determine their own futures in the country. So those are what I'm hearing. I also received, and I'm noticing that Pashtana is with us, but just to provide a real life context, and this is also part of the context of day-to-day life in Afghanistan I subscribe to. There are a number of organizations that provide security alerts to foreign, international, and NGO actors in Afghanistan. And one of my security alerts mentioned that there had been some attacks in Kabul in one of the main routes going to the airport, or some road closures. And that certainly is in line with some of the things I've heard from my colleagues who are helping with refugee resettlement today. So I'm not sure if the inability for Muscat to be able to participate with us today is impacted by those real life security concerns, but just to provide that as a backdrop, that this is an ongoing context and part of the landscape with this work. So Ken, back to you.
Thanks so much, Athena, for that really lucid overview of the situation from your perspective. I do see that Pashtana has joined us now. Pashtana, do you have some comments on the current situation? Could you just, I'm not sure if your video is working.
My video is not working. I just have to connect
okay.
to the data. Yeah. So.
Well, welcome to the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. So as we are talking about what is happening in Afghanistan right now, as we speak of, there as an Afghan and as an Afghan woman, there are some times that you have to understand how the reality works, right? And you have to understand that there are things that are happening, and then there are things that are a greater priority. We lost a government, and it was a democratic government, but even if it was a weak institution, it was still an institution. Right now, we don't have those sorts of institutions. At the moment, we are talking to the whole southern region of Afghanistan has paralyzed subsidized maternal health care and public health care. We don't have any more public health care access to the whole southern Afghanistan, which is Helmand, Zabul, Imroz, Rozgan, and Kandahar. And this is the data that I got just this evening from Zabul, that the clinic has stopped working in that province too. So that's something that is damaging. I know people are fleeing. I know people are resettling, but at the same time, not everyone can flee, right? Not everyone has access to that support system. And the people who are staying there are women who are pregnant. There are women who would want to, like, access maternal health care, which is prenatal health care or postnatal health care, and they are not getting that. That's the first thing. The second thing is the humanitarian response, which the international organizations are failing to provide at the moment, to be honest. A, because of banking. B, because, to be honest, at this point, I'm not sure how they are tackling this whole situation. And apart from that, the most important thing is the girls' education, as Lauren and Athena both talked about. So I just want to say the fact that we have to understand that this is not the first time that we are seeing this crisis. It has been on repeat in Afghanistan for quite some time now. This is the third wave that is happening in the past 6 decades. And this happened in the 80s and the 70s, where our political institutions got corrupt. They got to a point where it was either urbanized or, like, rural areas. There was no connection. The gap was built. And then in the 90s, the gap got so wide that the people from the rural areas or people who were alienated came to power and just took over everything. Why? And the same is happening right now. See, I know people would say, okay, the Taliban are not Afghans. They are from either Pakistan or, like, from Iran, and they're supported from all that. But these are Afghan people, right? Why are they alienated? Why were they alienated in the past whole 2 decades, or, like, 25 years? I just want to highlight the fact that services never reached them. If you don't have electricity, if you don't have clinic, not that I'm justifying what they do, that they are murdering people is okay, that them abusing human rights is okay. It's not. They are literally abusing my own family. I have family members who are missing right now. My sister was missing, and we just found her 3 hours ago, and I'm still stressed about it. But the fact that why did this happen and why it is still happening, we have to analyze that. And I come from a rural area, and one thing I have to understand, I have to make sure that we highlight on this webinar, is the fact that services never reached people. The majority of Afghanistan, even if it got out of Kabul, it remained, and it was limited to the main cities of Afghanistan. That's the first thing. The second thing is the government was too corrupt to care about Afghans. I'm going to be honest. The international community was too distracted to even put checks and balances in place to ask where the money is going, how is it going, what is happening, where is the transparency, how many schools are being built, what is the ratio, or how many people are graduating, what is the ratio of that, how many children are being vaccinated. None of those things happened in the past, and that is the reason that we are still suffering right now. I was watching this, I was seeing this cartoon that a friend of mine put on her WhatsApp stories. It's like in 2001, we just didn't have, like, a human being which is like depicted, like, showing that it's Afghanistan. It has one leg, and it doesn't have the person doesn't have the other leg, and the US comes and gives them, like, these 2 stands to stand on. And then in 2021, they take the other leg too. We are still standing on that stands, but we don't have the legs to stand on. The reason I'm trying to give you a clear answer right now, these crises are created by the international community. They should unfreeze our assets so that people can access, international organizations can access all these funds to help the people. And the second thing is, why prosecute people? Why not put and legitimize, why legitimize the Doha deal? They could have just literally told them, okay, this is your boundary, this is their boundary. Why did the whole ex-government have to flee, and there is no person held accountable at the moment for Afghans and Afghanistan? This is all a man-created chaos, which is actually started by the Taliban and the international community. So yeah, we have water shortages, we have drought, we have people who are dying, who are being targeted. Yes, our girls are at home. Yes, our women are not going to school. But why and who, because of who? It's all because of the international community and the Taliban, who were whitewashed, who were legitimized in the past 2 years. I just don't want to say that, okay, the international community didn't do anything, but they could have done much more things. They could have sent a man to UN Women, and they could have, like, stood by it, but they didn't. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Prasthana, for your perspective, and thanks for joining us. And I hope you're staying safe where you are at the moment, and things are fine. So I wanted to carry on with the discussion and remind people that if they'd like to put some questions in the chat box to please place them there and we can discuss them. I think Lauren had sent me an email earlier on in the week arguing that or mentioning that Monday, October 11th was International Day of the Girl. And we could also make light of this on the date that this girls' schools from grades 7 to 12 are still closed indefinitely in Afghanistan. There's also the G20 Special Summit, which was where member states were deciding whether to recognize the Taliban government or not. As you know, I think the Taliban have been trying to kind of make themselves a little bit more respectable or have a sort of facade of respectability in terms of the international community. I was also thinking about their overtures and their discussions with other Gulf states, for instance, like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, where they're meeting. And I always wondered if there was a way in which the Western powers could use Saudi Arabia, could use other countries, Pakistan, for instance, to kind of try and influence the Taliban in terms of what they're actually doing. So that could lead into a question, or the theme of the question, of whether government should actually recognize the Taliban and to what extent to engage with them. And there is a kind of attitude from certain Western sectors that we should never engage with groups that are organizations like the Taliban, that they're beyond the pale, if you like, of engagement, that we can't really negotiate with terrorists. But we've seen in the past, of course, that we have negotiated with terrorists. We've negotiated with far worse governments, and there's not many worse governments than the Taliban in that respect. But I'm still trying to think of practical solutions. We talk a lot about the negative aspects of the Taliban, and of course there are highly numerous the negative aspects, but is there ways in which we can see ourselves actually engaging in some sort of dialogue with them? And on that basis, what would the dialogue consist of? So maybe if you could give some thoughts on that, Lauren, because I know you're highly engaged in this. This is a dilemma, right? This is a major kind of political dilemma. Do you engage with these groups? Because it's clear that whatever we've been doing with the Taliban, and I think Pashtana made that point very clear, that services were not getting to areas where the Taliban, and there's clearly an incredible amount of resentment in that fact, right, by the Taliban. What do we do in that situation? How do we actually engage? How do we talk? Which is probably the most difficult question of all in some ways.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. And I mean, the reality is now they are the government, right? That is who you talk to if you want to do something in Afghanistan. So it's somewhat inescapable. And I wish very much it didn't come to this. And I share Pashtana's view that the international community was very complicit in this outcome. But alas, this is the outcome. So yeah, how to deal with it going forward. I mean, one of my thoughts on this is that we should avoid the mistakes that were made in the last 2 years that brought us to the situation. And that was legitimizing the Taliban and emboldening them by the way the peace negotiations were handled. So the main party at fault there is the United States government and how they handled that through their representative Zalmay Khalilzad, who's now nowhere to be found when the Taliban are reneging on the various things they promised. One example, I think just a few days ago, they said that they will in fact talk to ISIS terrorist groups, and that was one of the promises of the deal, right? So what happened from February 2020, when the US signed this bilateral agreement with the Taliban without the involvement of perhaps the main party, the Afghan government, and the other one being the Afghan people. So just this bilateral agreement where they made all kinds of commitments around Afghanistan without actually talking to the government of that country or the people of that country. I think that was the first fatal mistake that emboldened the Taliban and made them feel like an important actor and that they could simply ask what they wanted and get it. And they continued to do so as they continued to violate the agreement and then see no penalty for that. And I truly believe that 2 years ago, the Taliban never dreamed of this day, that they would actually rule again. I think they were brought to that belief through the actions of the US and then the surrounding international community. And I have to say, including Canada, as things got worse and worse leading up to August 15th, when the Taliban captured Kabul, there was a last ditch effort by the government of the UK to rally some of the coalition countries and say, let's prevent this. Like, this is getting really bad. It looks like the government may collapse. The US is not going to backtrack on the withdrawal. Is there any interest in doing something? And they reported that the other coalition countries did not demonstrate any interest, and that includes Canada. And that's quite disappointing. So I think we shouldn't make those mistakes, that you want to keep some leverage. And there's things the Taliban do care about. They care about sanctions being imposed on them. They care about the travel ban. They care about money. They have no money to run the government. And that's actually, one of my primary concerns right now, apart from the human rights issues. You have a party ruling that doesn't actually know how to govern. One microcosm example of that is the airport. They don't have the first clue how to manage an airport. So they've asked another country to do it. Qatar is managing the airport. And you're going to see that situation repeated with everything, with telecommunications, with water management. The country's in danger of losing its access to power because the Taliban are not paying the electricity bill. So there's been this complicity in installing a government that doesn't really know how to run a country, and the people who will pay the price for that are Afghans. And then, so I think in engaging with them, there has to be some leverage retained. You don't play all your cards right at the beginning, and then maybe some progress can be made. But I just want to wrap up my comment here with something perhaps controversial, but it's my own conclusion from watching the Taliban for 25 years now. And this is one thing I've learned about them, is it looks to us as Westerners, because this is how we interpret the world. We think people do things for a reason, and we assume that the Taliban waged violence to achieve something perhaps more noble, that they had to do this dirty work to get the kind of society and state that in their minds is the only legitimate one. And it was just unfortunate that they had to use terrorism as the means to do this. But I think we have that wrong. I think that the Taliban's means and ends are violence. They use violence to get power, but they want to continue applying violence to people when they're in power. And I think we've just missed that in the West, in our interpretation of the Taliban. And someone who helped me understand this was an Afghan intellectual from the Shia minority. And he changed his name actually to Buddha. That's not his real name, but he goes by the name Buddha because the Taliban destroyed in honor of the Buddha statues that the Taliban destroyed in Bamiyan province. And he said that the Taliban ritualize violence. And you can see this if you've ever had the misfortune to see one of their snuff videos, where they film an execution. And they there's like curtains in the background and music playing, and they take time to decorate the scene like it's a a performance, an artistic performance. They're ritualizing violence, celebrating violence. And that's, you know, just one example. And you can see that multiplied in their actions, that they are death cult, actually. And so I think we have to ask the question, who have we empowered? You know, with the US and the international community having brokered the installation of a Taliban government in Kabul, and then sitting back and saying, well, you know, this has happened, there's nothing we can do, we just have to deal with it now. You know, they've, I think they've created something very, very dangerous. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Athena, do you have anything to say on that? Or?
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Lauren, for those points. I also share the view that the current situation in Kabul, as Pashtana articulated, is the international community has been very complicit, and that also includes propping up the Taliban to have been in a position of power at the moment. I think that's an interesting observation, Lauren, about power and how the Taliban equates power. And I have had conversations with some of my artist friends, actually, in Kabul, who are, some are still present in Kabul and some have been able to leave. But the idea of power being equated with violence and domination, in part also shaped by the decades of military occupation in Kabul, and how people are able to achieve power or achieve social capital or achieve recognition on the world stage if they are in fact ruthless holders and keepers of power. And so I have heard that there are some people in the Kabul community, or some people, actors in the Afghan communities, who have been former child soldiers, who are now wanting to be moderate members of society, or peace builders now in Afghan society, who have just grown up knowing war. As children, they would go to school and see fighting, step over people who had been killed in numerous, in the bombings to overtake their country. But they still stood resistant despite of there's a fierce resistance also for, I would say, an ordinary Afghan feels very proud and wanting to have their country be recognized for its culture, for its resilience, for the very rich traditions and contributions to history, to art, to music, to culture in the world that is right now being obfuscated by darkness, by the Taliban, by just being quote unquote primitive in the eyes of the world. And I think that is something that, again, in the collective consciousness in Afghanistan, there's that feeling of feeling persecuted by the international community for being an Afghan. So the Taliban rides on that persecution in order to prove that being an Afghan can still be taken from a position of power. And I think there's the literal interpretation of that has been conditioned by the failures of the international community. So I will leave it. And as far as governance, I've just been reading the comments that there are there are a number of people who have experience or have been listening to different perspectives and actors in Afghanistan. And there are a number of people agreeing that there has been corruption. There has been corruption in the military, in local government actors in Afghanistan, and not having a model of proper governance to be able to follow in ways that are compatible with the values that have been crushed by the international community as they have been occupying the country for decades. I'll leave that there.
Thanks, Athena. Pashtana, do you have a comment on that?
Like, yeah, I totally agree with Lauren and Athena, what they actually said, like, and it's very brave of them. Like, you know, they have been to Afghanistan, and definitely they know how the international community works, and they are reconfirming what is actually on the ground, what happened, and people were so afraid. It's like, you know, I'm gonna be honest, I may be called out on these things. Either you're pro-Taliban or you're anti-Taliban. There is no in between, right? Either you are with the government, the ex-government actually, or you're a Taliban apologist. But at the end of the day, I'm just a civilian, right? I'm a normal civilian who wants to go to her university, who wants to go to her job, and wants to continue her normal way of life. But no, the government has to come up with different sets of rules to harass me, to put me into a box and limit me and control me. The international community wouldn't even talk to people like us, to be very honest at this point. I'm going to be very, very honest with you. It's like, post withdrawal, it's like, we are getting some time. And even with that, if I only the reason is because I know English, I'm going to be very honest with you. We had the debates in Kabul where people would invite each other on a $25,000 debate, where they would book hotels and call in all these people who would speak English and just talk to each other, while we had literal crisis of malnutrition, postmortem hemorrhage happening in Helmand, where we had people who were starving in central Afghanistan, where were people who were literally leaving from Ghazni to go to Kandahar because there was drought happening. So you have to understand where the international community's priorities lie. And that's the reason every time you alienate a civilian, they go and join one side of the fight. If you are pro-government, you'll go on and join the army. But if you alienate the orphans and the children and the wife and the grandchildren of the same army member who was killed in the line of duty, their grandchildren or someone is probably going to go and join the Taliban, because maybe at least there they will be accepted, there they will be fed, there they will be clothed. So the reason is the Taliban are just a day job, like the Daesh is becoming a day job. It's not something that the people believe in. It's just something that they wanted. And the government in the past have alienated the Afghan community, the Afghan rural population. And out of Kabul, there is an Afghanistan which exists, which needs services, which needs electricity, right? Which needs the same healthcare system, which needs the same sort of education. But nobody talks about it. Nobody wants to focus on that. Everybody is so fascinated with the Taliban, how they're acting normal, for praising them for just existing, for praising them to showing up to panel discussions in Doha. I mean, like, they're part of the government. They are not supposed to be doing all that. They're supposed to be running a country, right? They are literally coming up on Twitter and showing themselves, and running PR campaigns for themselves. That's not a country, how a country is run. That's what the ex-government did, and they failed miserably. They literally failed miserably, and they are doing literally the same thing. You don't run a country on Twitter. That's not how it works. And they are literally following the same steps. And the same goes for human rights abuses. The ex-government have abused people. They abused anyone that they could find, as long as it was not going to international media. The current government is doing the same. The ex-government was taking all the money that they could just to fill in their pockets because their greed was big. The current government is also looking for opportunities, and that's the reason our girls' education is being exploited, is used as a bargaining chip. Women in workforce are being used as bargaining chips. So I'm just going to say it, it's not Afghan government, it's not Taliban, Islamic theories or anything else. It's just in the past we had men who would dress up like in white in tie and three-piece and show up to work and had the same mentality, which is like, our the Thai Taliban. I would call them necktie Taliban. And right now we have men who have big egos because they won this holy war. They brought down a superpower, and they feel like they are chosen by God to rule over the country. And no matter how they choose to rule over it, nobody's gonna care. And the only reason they want this legitimacy is just to fish for more money. That's it. Nobody cares about Afghanistan, and nobody cared about Afghanistan or Afghans. I just want to end on this note, because we talk about what is happening in Afghanistan. Humanitarian crises are happening. Girls are not going to school. Women are suffering. Human rights abuses are happening to ethnicities. But what are we doing? What is the next step towards it? Do we talk to the Taliban? How do we engage them? When the Doha deal was being legitimized, why didn't anybody think about that? Why didn't the international community think about that? Why didn't the last government think about that? Why didn't all these elite women who were in power didn't think about that? We chose them as our representatives, and what did they do at the end of the day? So I at this point, yes, I am very emotional, but at the same time, I am also disappointed, because everybody that we chose in the past 2 decades failed us. And the current government is already failing us. It's not someone that we have chosen, and it will continue. I don't know until when.
Thanks, Pashtan. I take your point very seriously that everyone's sort of failed Afghanistan, from all the interventions over the years, from the British Empire all the way through to the Russians, and the latest kind of American withdrawal, they've not solved anything. In fact, they've made the situation probably 10 times worse than it could ever have been. But I do have a question which is coming in about engagement again, and the meaning of engagement, because it's either we try to engage with the Taliban and try to change them in the hope that we can change them, or we don't engage with them at all, and we just simply put pressure on them to change in some other way, which may just play into their hands. But there is a question that, I mean, how do we engage through beyond sort of countries like the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia? And I was thinking about Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia, has a kind of extreme kind of form of Islamic government as well, and has had for a long time. But there has been some progress in Saudi Arabia over the years in terms of allowing women and girls, etc., some access to education, resources. Women are allowed to drive, etc., now in Saudi Arabia. So there has been some improvement, even if it's incremental. So how could we sort of engage beyond this kind of traditional notion of just states interfering or states intervening? How do we actually get to talk to them? And the other question, of course, is what does Canada do? What kind of message does Canada send to, and we know that Canada is enthralled to the United States in terms of its foreign policy generally, but how do we react? So I think these are important questions to consider as well. I mean, we can talk about how bad the situation is for a long time, and we know it's bad. We know it's horrific, and you've expressed that very deeply. But how do we try and change the situation?
I'll share that question with everybody, but I see a few questions in the chat about money, so I might just quickly address that easier question perhaps first. And it's something that's changing constantly, and it changes week by week. So there's been moments where there was basically no way to get money in, and now there's some new options that have come up, and perhaps more or less in the future. So yeah, the banks are allowing individuals to withdraw $200 US a week maximum. So a lot of people are just going to the bank like once a week, every Monday at the same time, waiting in line to get out, trying to get their savings out, and probably leave eventually, or at least cover household expenses. And businesses and organizations can withdraw. So that's basically closed the banking system to agencies and companies. So to get around that, some of the things that are being used are money transfers, Western Union, MoneyGram, and the Hawala system for larger amounts, as well as mobile money transfers. So in our case, we are able to move money in the country, but not the same way we used to. There's a far greater administrative burden to moving it because you're sending smaller amounts in different ways at higher rates, but there is ways to get money in. So I just want to clarify that. Parallel to the needs in Afghanistan, I expect we're going to see growing needs for a growing diaspora country too. I heard the other day that there are now more Afghans outside of Afghanistan than inside of Afghanistan. And we've been advocating hard for safe passage on both sides, the Taliban allowing people to leave, but also neighboring countries and others allowing Afghans to enter. And I think, we have to abide by the principle that everybody who wants to leave should be allowed to leave. And that will actually be the best option for many, many people, from artists to women's activists to, any ordinary person that just wants to live a life that the Taliban doesn't approve of. I think they should all have the right to leave, as we would want if we lived there too. And then another quick comment about, in trying to find, I guess, an optimistic lens on the situation, I don't think everything is lost in terms of the investments made in the past 20 years. And a good example of that is that in 2001, when the Taliban rule ended that time, And it was kind of a new dawn in the country, and everything had to start from scratch. Everything from, schooling for kids to the banking sector. There were no banks open then either, to telecommunications. The country was a little further ahead because of things that either happened in the past, women who were educated in the 60s, as Athena referred to, or the 70s, or who studied abroad in the 80s, or who were able to access education outside of Afghanistan. And one of the great things that happened during the 1980s in Pakistan was that the International Rescue Committee, IRC, had the foresight to deliver education to refugees in camps at a time when the popular thinking was, emergency needs only. Give people blankets, food, water, but you can't think beyond those emergency needs. But IRC said, no, they also need education. And they delivered that education, and they trained teachers, and they trained the trainers of teachers. And in 2001, when those people came back into Afghanistan, they brought with them skills, and they were able to immediately start training teachers in the new public education system and put people to work. So I think, everything that has happened in the past 20 years and everything that we do from now onwards is still an investment for those in the country. My good friend is working with Save the Children in Afghanistan. And she said, what do you think all those educated women are going to do now that they're at home? They're going to teach people in their homes. They're going to gather a few kids from the neighborhood and teach them reading and writing in their living room. So there'll still be things happening in the country. And then the things that happen outside the country could serve, Afghanistan in the future. And we never know what's going to happen. The country has a long history of regime change, as you alluded to, Ken. And so we don't know how long this particular regime will last. And when a new one comes, the needs will be great. And we want there to be people who will be able to address those needs.
Thanks, Lauren. Athena, do you have something on that?
Yeah, sure. So I had an interview some time ago, and this question was asked, and some of the thoughts that I had at the time are largely unchanged. So the humanitarian crisis, the needs are great, as Lauren just described, and they are getting greater by the day. And I think there's a lot of work that the international humanitarian actors have potential to do that are not currently doing. On the one hand, people are saying they don't have the authority or not being given space to act, and receiving humanitarian aid dollars is not filtering through with the current government. But that's incorrect because, as I think I mentioned before, and Pashtana has also stated, that the money is just being frozen by specifically the UK and the US governments. So the inability to recognize the Taliban as the current government is trickling down to just have impact on it's making the humanitarian crisis worse. Sanctions are just going to, the people who are paying for the sanction will not be the government or the Taliban. It will be an ordinary Afghan. So I think there was a question I think Wanda asked in the chat box about what partnerships are possible. So there are still some international humanitarian actors in the country that have built relationships of trust, and I think those could be continued. I think that I'm parts of, again, I'm external right now because I don't have the ability to go to Afghanistan due to family commitments, but I think that also international actors or religious actors have a lot of ability to create partnerships of trust, of shared solidarity that right now the Taliban is not feeling that they have ability to negotiate in good faith with government actors. I know that the Taliban has also stated, I think as Lauren has mentioned, they have some relationships of trust with governments of Qatar. To some degree, Saudi Arabia, they're in discussions to have the Saudi Arabian government support the educational transition at the moment. And then we also have China as an actor that is being sought out right now by the Taliban for infrastructure development. So while the United States may be unhappy about the choices that the government right now is making in order to reach out and create partnerships globally, I think that there's potential to be able to recognize that there may be will for international actors to support the rebuilding right now of Afghanistan. I think there's a lot of question marks about and I think Wace also mentioned in the chat box that the Taliban have mentioned commitments before and circled back on them or not completed them. So I think the public are not hopeful that the Taliban will keep their commitments. But I think that there's, in light of any other infrastructure, there's hope that there can be a way forward in a way that that suffering is minimal. An important distinction also to understand too is that the Taliban aren't broke. They have a lot of assets in. Yes, they've received weapons from foreign governments, but they also have they do enforce taxation. They do have money in the form of well, I don't know how legal it would be considered by the international community. They do have $416 million accounted for of global opium production in the past 5 years, mining extraction and extortion and taxes. So they do have, I'll put an article, because there has been some interest on how Taliban finances their regime. I can put an article in the chat box. But the distinction that is important to make here is because there are so many people who are affiliated with Taliban, and I think Pashtana said there's also Thai Taliban, but one of the reasons that I think is also important to understand is that this is not new, but for many women, when I worked in Kabul, one of the things that I found very interesting in hospitals that were segregated by gender, in the women's section of hospitals, that was an interesting area for women to come together, to mobilize, to share experiences, and plan initiatives to increase education, to increase healthcare access, to increase affordability for their medications, and even, yes, family planning. So because of those abilities to mobilize in hospital, I do think in part that is one of the reasons why hospital actors and hospital spaces have been targeted by the Taliban. But in those types of spaces, it was safe for women to congregate and be heard because they were surrounded by other women, but in the safety even of their own homes, it's difficult to understand, or it's difficult to discern who might be providing information to an outside or affiliated Taliban actor. So that level of just being surveilled, or the inability to understand who is a trusted actor is still felt. I think it's probably felt even more palpably in people's private homes. Because the Taliban, and this is all linking back to the Taliban does hold a reserve of financial wealth, but they don't distribute it publicly. It's distributed all privately and based on favors, trading of information. And again, the Taliban is not necessarily a centralized force, so it also depends on which aspect or which region of the Taliban you're affiliated with to be able to receive these gifts, or as Pashtana said earlier, you'll be able to eat, you'll be able to receive money to pay your bills if you affiliate with the right group of people. So I think an important distinction to make is that the Taliban is not broke, but the government is, because of the lack of infrastructure, as Lauren stated, to be able to rule the country. The networks are not intact. People are not, the Taliban actors are not, they don't have the relationships built with communities on the ground necessarily in a way that can distribute resources or allocate resources equitably or in ways that would be the most helpful for humanitarian assistance. So in that respect, I think humanitarian actors likely will not go away, but they will need to find a different way to navigate relationships. I think as external actors, we will need to reflect on our failures in the past 2 years specifically, but in the past 20 years, definitely, there are failures that the international community is still not willing to admit or learn from, or in order to rebuild. So I think these are all important distinctions to be made. And I'll close there and then turn back to you.
Thanks so much for those really great, insightful comments. Pashtana, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Like on your engagement thing, I thought about it when, like, when Lauren and Athena were answering the question. I mean, like, they have a very valid point when it comes to Afghanistan, and I feel like they are very educated when it comes to how Afghanistan works at the moment, and how it can, like, yes, of course the country will go on, politics will change, as Lauren says, but in the few years The country will have a different government, and then probably we will have these people who are teaching at home will be teaching in schools if they don't open the schools now. Like, there is no stopping to the knowledge. That's I totally agree with. And as Athena said, that women would collectively come together and talk in hospitals, mobilize and help each other. So the fact that people say that Afghans are not helping themselves, Afghans are, only if the other Western countries don't waltz in and bring in people to rule us every 2 decades. That's like the first thing. But if they do, here's the thing: they have the leverage to for us to engage with them. At this point, if you are bringing them in your choppers, in your planes, that means you have connections with them. And if you have connections with them, that means that you can engage with them, right? And that has happened in the past. US has engaged with the terrorists, and it will continue engaging with the terrorists for the sake of her own security, and to at this point, security, that's what they care about. Not that Afghans and Afghan lives are on a priority, to be honest, at this point. The second thing, yes, as a country, how do we engage with the Taliban? See, the Taliban are not educated. They don't know the first thing about governance. They need civilians to be part of the government to actually provide the services that are needed. They wouldn't understand how electricity works, how the Afghanistan Brishna Shirkat works, how the Afghanistan Bank works, or how school works, how normal curriculum is developed. They might have policing policies that they would love to implement because that is what their egoistic or patriarchal mind has shown them or taught them, right? But they don't know how to do that. That's the first thing. The second thing is how much international community feels important when they are engaging with them, right? On what terms are they engaged? I mean, like I heard Lauren, who said like, oh, but we are here for the humanitarian crisis, the international diplomats were saying, and nobody's caring about the women at the moment. Women are not a priority. Women rights are not a priority. I mean, like, you literally have a platform right now. European Union has that, Canada has that, US has that. All these international organizations have these platforms. They can take all the women who are women leaders in Afghanistan, they can put them all on those places and make them engage with the Taliban right now. That's how you make engagement. That's how you make sure that they engage. If they don't, then probably tell them that, okay, that's the boundary. I'm not giving you aid. You wanted the girl. See, here's the thing. Hikmatyar has money. We have to understand that. Mullah Ghani brother has money. They have holdings in Pakistan. They have holdings, estate holdings in Qatar. All these people are rich. They are rich. They are not poor. They have opium money. Okay, they have drugs money. They have all sorts of money. They have worked for intelligence services. They have. They are not poor people, but they don't have that sort of money to run a country. And for them to be accepted as leaders, they need that sort of money. And that's where the international community can use that as a leverage. But also make sure that important Afghan people who have the capacity to run Afghanistan towards a better future should be placed on those areas. I know there are criteria and whatever, but no, it's not time for you to send me a European Union ambassador where you could be placing a very well-educated Afghan woman on that position, where you could be placing a woman in UN Women instead of sending me a man, right? So you have to understand the cultural context of Afghanistan. If you really want to engage with the Taliban, they have to come at terms with accepting women in the public space. You can't make them comfortable by replacing women with men, because a man is always wrong for a woman's job. That's what I want to end with, right? And that's what the international community is doing. They're literally making them comfortable in their offices by replacing women with the wrong men, And we shouldn't be doing that. You have to make them uncomfortable, but also in a sense where they can't lift a finger. They can't lift a finger over a UN ambassador. They can't lift a finger on a person or a hand that is feeding them. So you have to make sure that you always talk from the position of power. But at the same time, I don't know how the international community wants to do this. Maybe they just are so done with Afghanistan. Maybe after 20 years, when we become a security threat again, Afghanistan becomes a security threat again, maybe then they will try to engage again and want to use our rights and weaponize it to legitimize a war. Maybe that's what they will be doing in the next 20 years again. Or maybe the Daesh will be acceptable in the next 20 years, Maybe they will waltz in them and bring them in, and they'll be like, oh, let's engage with them. These are good people. They haven't done anything bad. And then by then another group will come up and they'll be like, oh, these are the bad people now, we hunt them down. So I'm sorry for being so informal, but it's just exhausting. I find it exhausting, all these people, all this money in Afghanistan, and they still don't know how to engage in Afghanistan. They still don't know how to make sure it happens. I mean, like how it's just like amusing to a human mind. For me, for myself, they have the power, they have the position, they have everything, but they still don't want to lift a finger.
Pashtana, I had the same thought when all of this was happening in August. I thought, well, maybe the US could put ISIS in charge in Iraq. Maybe they could broker Boko Haram power in Nigeria. Like, boggling. Yeah.
Thanks very much for those comments. I mean, it's really insightful to hear these voices because there's something different coming out here. I mean, we've tried all this idea of that we can intervene and we can fix these problems. I mean, the real problem is we're not really listening to people on the ground. We're not really listening to local voices. We're not really listening to how we can actually resolve these conflicts by looking at the perspective of people in Afghanistan rather than saying, well, here's our perspective from the Western kind of powers perspective, right? Here's what we should be doing, but it's obviously not worked. It's not worked in over 200 years in Afghanistan. No intervention into Afghanistan has ever succeeded on any of those terms. So maybe it's time to completely change the strategy, to completely change the way we're thinking about Afghanistan. And it's not just Afghanistan, of course, it's the entire region, it's Pakistan, it's Iran, it's the entire Middle East and that part of the world where governance strategies and any attempts to change those government strategies have completely failed because most of them have involved some sort of imposition of government on them or some sort of Western idea that we can negotiate or work our way through these. And of course, it's been a disaster. I mean, you look at Iraq, for instance, and I was thinking, talk about corruption of the Taliban and corruption of governance in the Middle East. But if you look at American corruption in Iraq and what the Americans did in Iraq, what they've done in Afghanistan, is phenomenal. So it might be time to actually change the terms of engagement completely, the terms of the way we actually look at it, the terms of the way we respond to it, and start thinking what's from a localized bottom-up perspective that we can deal with. But these have been great questions and great responses. I'm not actually sure where to go from here. It's such a dilemma. Athena wants to speak, so I'll let her.
Yeah, I'll just kind of piggybacking from your comments. So I just wanted to add one last, I know that we're running shorter on time, so perhaps moving towards a what next type of idea. Two things. One, just understanding the context. So as what I have been in Afghanistan, I've been back and forth to Kabul, and I have visited all 34 provinces in Afghanistan in a different capacity in different projects. One thing that is important to just anecdotally understand is the typical UN actor, as perceived by my colleagues in Afghanistan, would be that they would come to the country not have a solid understanding of the traditions, cultures, and Afghanistan typically would feel that they didn't have an underpinning respect for their culture. And they would have big parties with alcohol, which was not culturally relevant or appropriate in Afghanistan, with barbecuing a pig in their front yard. And just Afghans don't eat pork as well as part of their diet. So just that blatant disrespect from international UN actors is something that underpinned much of my interaction with local NGO actors. So I'm not sympathizing with the Taliban. I'm just suggesting that the disrespect shown by international actors was part of the force about why the Taliban does not approve of external actors in their country, because of the blatant disrespect and the money. So international aid has filtered through Afghanistan. Afghanistan has been the recipient of international aid dollars within the top 3 countries consistently over the past 25 years. But within that, on average, 86 cents of every international aid dollar will go to an expat salary or security for an expat. And so the anger and resentment has, based on that inequity and that lack of aid filtering down to where it is needed most, has been part of the fuel of the Taliban's resistance for external actors and external support. So that is part of the background context. So what next? I think we need to develop a new way, Ken, like you just said, to just being more humble as an international humanitarian actor, listening to what people's needs and desires to self-determine are on them. I think the humanitarian sector broadly, if I may create a parallel, is undergoing this type of a soul-searching space, a soul-searching phase of, are we really doing good? Are we really doing more good? Are we really preventing harm based on how the current structures and policies and procedures are set up? So Afghanistan is a salient example of the failure of the international community to listen to what is desired, or prioritizing the international community's needs over the needs that are local. So the desire and drive for a localization agenda, I think, is very much relevant in the humanitarian sector at large, but certainly within Afghanistan. I'm seeing comments in the chat box, of course, of whose voices need to be part of the rebuilding. Pashtana also suggested, and I think it's been brought up, that women currently are excluded from rebuilding of the country. I think that the international community sending over male envoys who are white and powerful has been a start. It seems to be the typical way that we work as an international community, but that does need to stop. I know that when I have been in Afghanistan, I hear different stories because I'm not white and because I'm perceived as someone who has more in common with an ordinary Afghan than someone who is white and working with the UN. And I'm not stating that I'm a better external actor or that the UN is an ineffective actor in this instance, but just the tensions of people need to be able to see themselves reflected in the systems and institutions that are there to serve them. So we need to see more women, we need to see more experience with what is going on in communities within the restructuring of Afghanistan, and that includes sending over people to discuss with the Taliban what next. And like Pashtana said, we need to have more voices from women in those instances. So I think I started out this comment about, Ken, where do we go from here? Dialogue needs to happen, but I think we may be sending in the wrong people to kick that off. But it's the way we know, and perhaps we just need to re-examine what we think we know. We have a number of Afghan voices also in the chat box that are still stating their experience, and I hope that the series of webinars is also a way to amplify women's voices and amplify voices from people on the ground, because I think that is the most important thing that we need to be able to do, is listen and amplify and follow what is most needed.
Thanks, Athena. Pashtana, do you have any final comments? We've had some great quotes and some great questions. I've got a question from Wanda Kraus directed to you, saying, is it the case that there are men within the Taliban itself that share the perspective that women should be included? Do you have any comment on that? And thanks to Wanda for the question.
It's okay. In case, did she say South or in the Taliban? You see, here's the thing. In Taliban, you have to understand that there are two sections that we are looking at right now. The Haqqani factor, they're a military power, and they don't like to talk about women or education or anything like that. Then there is this political, mildly moderate sort of, even if they are not, they are trying to show it, sort of people who wants to be seen as diplomats or intellectuals or people who, like, who shaped this war and who are not even valued at personally on the Taliban level, because for them, who fought the war is actually a war hero and everybody else is not. So for us to understand that, they probably, if you look at their Twitter handles right now, of course, Afghanistan is all run on Twitter right now, but you have to look at it. If you look at their Twitter handles, Suhail Shaheen tweets, girls are going to school in Kunduz, but his whole government hasn't talked about the whole of girls' education right now. This is a pattern that you keep on seeing. Moderate Taliban are trying to promote this agenda of women's rights. Women are coming out in our own favor. But to support what? What policy? You support a government that has a policy that makes you feel good about your rights, and you go out and you support it, or you are anti those policies and you protest it. But what are they happy about? What are these women celebrating? What specific Islamic policy is there that all these women in hijab are coming out and supporting them? So you have to understand that they are also looking for legitimacy, and they are more than happy to see more women coming out and supporting them. And I have seen all these Afghan women in the diaspora who are actually supporting them, to be honest. They're like, okay, yeah, these are good people, let's give them time, maybe they'll bring in some changes. Let's call a spade a spade, and that's a reality. They have abused people, they have abused minorities, they have abused religious minorities, they have abused women's rights, and they continue to do so. People who would attack schools like Sayyid al-Shada school, an ethnic minority and religious school of young girls, is not human in my mind, okay? And we cannot just whitewash it after 2 months. That's not possible. Now, yes, they want support, they want legitimacy, they want women to support them, and that is happening all over the world. I saw all these big think tanks, big names, actually supported the Taliban in the past 2 years and whitewashed their theories and all that. So these things happen, but in reality, who's going to hold them accountable? It's not the support that they get from the women. Who's going to hold them accountable when they actually abuse more and more women on the ground? That's the first thing. The second thing is way forward. Yes, engage with them from a territory where you do have some leverage over them, not like you just gave in the past, like in the Doha deal. And then again, when you gave them Afghanistan on a silver platter. I have news from the people in Iraq. They are still astonished at the fact that they don't believe that they are roaming around in Iraq right now. This is how the Taliban feel right now. They're like, we can't believe that we are here, but so fast, so soon. So they themselves want that legitimacy. Yes, engaging with them is the way forward. I don't want to deny it. I have to be pragmatic and practical, although I'm an emotional Afghan right now. But also, apart from that, if we engage with them, how do we engage with them? That's most important. How do we set terms? And who gets to talk? Who gets to represent the actual voices? That's very important, because Khalilzad did a very good job in securing deal for the US and ignoring a whole nation, sacrificing, like we sacrifice goat before a good thing, ceremony or something, and he literally sacrificed the whole Afghanistan for the US. So who gets to engage? That's very important. On what terms to engage? That's very important. Engagement is the way forward, so that tomorrow Daesh doesn't become legitimate government. But how do we engage? On what level do we engage? That's very important. Who gets to engage? That's very important. And most importantly, Afghans not being left out of it. Elite Afghans with 2 passports who have lived all their life in the West shouldn't be engaging on my behalf. That's very important for me,
Thanks so much, Pashtana, and thanks to everyone that took part today. Thanks to Lauren and Athena. And Athena did a great job in putting together this panel as well. And thanks to Selena very much for helping to organize it and put it together. And I'm not sure if Selena wants to say a few words to finish up, but I'm very grateful to you, Selena, for doing this fantastic work as well, to bring people together and engage in this dialogue, because it's so important and so enriching to tackle these questions. These are huge questions, difficult questions, and Afghanistan, although a lot of us regarded, of course, what's happening as a tragedy, I think part of this webinar has highlighted that there is hope. There is the possibility of change. That once you give people education, once you give children, women, girls education, it's almost impossible to take back. That's the one thing you can't take away. You can't take away someone's education. And the fact is that has been such an important kind of improvement in some ways, and will last. Like Lauren was saying, these women will bring in children from the village and educate them, etc. That is change. That is real political and social change for the better. But Selena, maybe you could finish up a bit.
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you so much for moderating today's discussion, and Athena, Lauren, Pashtana for being just amazing panelists, and for everyone who joined us live and was engaging in the chat box, sharing your thoughts, your insights, and questions for us to explore today. Given our time constraints, we weren't able to dive into all of the questions, but do know that this is actually the first of a 3-part webinar series where we will continue discussions on this topic and bring in different Afghan voices and experts and panelists to amplify what's going on right now. We'll be sure to send an invitation to our second session to all those who registered for this one today. So with that, I will wish you all a safe and good rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening, depending where in the world you're joining us from or watching today's recording. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.